Thank you everyone again for joining us today. We're here to talk to you about implementing best practices to mitigate COVID-19 in an education setting. Today we have with us Michael Willett and Bar Liverant. They're going to be walking you through the presentation today. A few housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute, but if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the questions or chat sections, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. We are also recording this, and we will be sending out the recording along with some other resources for you either later today or tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Great, thanks Danielle. I just wanted to frame this up on the front end just by talking about a little bit of a few of the challenges that you all may be facing in the education space, across our community. We've listed a few of them here. I'm sure there are many, many more, but just to talk about a few, and these are also a few that I think Bar is going to focus on today to show you how Archibus can help address some of these challenges, as you all try to get back to school and back to some sense of normalcy in your spaces. So, the first one there, I'm not going to necessarily talk about every single one of them, but the first one, is a big one. Reducing that classroom capacity, based on all these social distancing guidelines that have been put forth, is a big one. You're basically being asked to operate with a fraction of the amount of space that you had available to you in the past. We're going to talk a little bit about ways to handle that and ways the software can help guide some of those decisions. The next one there, identifying additional usable space. That's always important, right? Especially in these times when we are cutting our space down by a fraction. Our utilization percentages are drastically different than they were in the past. So we've got to be able to find that additional space and be able to make use of it. Hopefully we're not putting people in janitors' closets and things like that. But there's likely a lot of available space out there that you may or may not even thought about that software can help you, identify. My daughter is getting ready to go back to school at the end of next week. And one of their approaches is the next line item there, and allocating students by shifts, phases. So she's in the afternoon session, and our Archibus can help manage and coordinate a lot of that activity, and even the potentially the cleaning and the sanitization that goes on in between those shifts as well. So Archibus can help track and manage those levels of activity so that that everybody is as safe as possible. As we talk about higher education, dorms are a big concern, right? And being able to understand where your students are in those dorms and how they interact, and that is going to be very important. Archibus can help you understand that. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's not always just about the students, but the staff and the faculty as well. So I think Bar is going to touch on a few of those areas as well, in how to mitigate and track those back to work, or set up and manage those back to work plans for your staff. And those roll into every layer of your challenges, right? Because the staff is probably one of the most important pieces of your overall campus back to work activity. They're relied on top to bottom, and they're going to be a piece of probably every or almost every single challenge and mitigation type activity that you take going forward. So I'll stop talking now, but I'll turn this over to Bar, and we'll get to the meat of the presentation. And as Danielle said, please fire questions at us in the question and chat area, and we'll address all those at the end. So thanks for attending, and Bar, to you.
Thank you, Michael. So just like before I'll go into the meat of the thing, I just wanted to focus attention to previous presentations and webinars that we have already done. So this presentation will focus specifically at back to school from the perspective of students mainly. And that's because a lot of the employee perspectives we already discussed in several other presentations that we we have done. The first one, we talked specifically about incident reporting, allocating PPEs. We then talked about the whole idea of CAD list for social distancing, move scenarios, hoteling, and reservation. And then there was a whole what's new in 25.2, where we put everything together, showed you the native social distancing tool in the Space Console and other ways to give attributes to employees. And so all these are already available to you, and you can take advantage of all these webinars to take, a very clear to understand what Archibus is capable of doing, helping you develop those strategies as you're thinking about back to school or back to work. The link that you see at the bottom of the screen, if you want to just write it down, or you can take it later on, will really take you to all this wealth of material that we created so far. So that's important. Also important to frame where I'm going, or where we're going with this presentation specifically, which is from the perspective of how do I bring students to a safe environment more than employees, even though, like I said, we already talk quite a lot about employees. Of course, they are extremely important in this process as well, as Michael said. So from the perspective of back to school or back to work, we kind of broke it down into three main phases, right? Because the challenges are so great, and the diversity of the occupants varies so much. There's students, there are workers, there's age differences, there are commuters that come in every day, there are people that are staying there in dorms, if it's higher education. So the diversity is so great that you really need to think about the plan very carefully. And so what Archibus have done, and this is how the presentation is also going to be, presented, is looking at the problem or the issue here at three phases, right? Planning, enabling, and then monitoring and adjusting. At the planning phase, we'll talk about identifying those spaces, and then try to really think about the reduction in capacity and what does it mean. And then identify the individuals that needs to go to those spaces, and making sure that we understand who they are, how they are categorized, and how do I assign them to space. Right, so in the same way, we want to also look at strategies, let's say like hoteling, maybe for higher education, that we can enable to make sure that students can remotely assign themselves to classes perhaps, and then be safe as they come in, because they're going to devote their time between being in classroom and working remotely, or learning in this case remotely. And of course, the monitoring is very important. How does the manager look at the list of who's in class, who's in school, and who is coming tomorrow, and create all that safe environment between those times. So again, just a very quick review before we get to the demo. Establishing the new room capacity is very important. So you can see on the right different ways of doing that. One is actually looking at all your space, whether it's K to 12 or whether it's higher education, and thinking about the strategy of reduction. Whether you want to do it by social distancing circles, like you see at the bottom image, or you want to actually look at every individual space, understand the square footage of it, and then divide it perhaps by the social distancing guidelines per individual as it goes through. And of course, how do you go to every individual room and make it available for, let's say, hoteling and whatnot? Once you're doing that, you're looking at every individual that you have coming into school or work. And we have developed this new mark employee to return to work / school, even though the label doesn't say / school. But the way that I'm going to talk about today is actually using that individual tool, tracking individuals, in this case, students. How do I give those students the attributes that are needed in order to allocate them correctly into space? How do I divide the cohorts into shifts and into, let's say, individual classrooms, and assign them to the classroom themselves? So you can see here, taking the whole cohort and putting it in classrooms in the right time. How do I designate specific spaces not available and other space as available? And how do I make sure that it's clean between the times that they're available and it's not? And then, of course, for higher education specifically, how do I take individual classrooms and turn those classrooms into a hoteled environment where students can maybe book a specific classroom remotely via maybe a QR code or via the workplace, as you can see over here, and then come into classroom, maybe check in via the same QR, interact with the instructor, and then move on. Where we need to understand that the majority, of course, of those individual students will actually be taking the class online just because of the issue of space that we're going to talk about in a second as well. And then lastly, we came up with, before the demo, we came up with several tools that can actually help you look in the metrics of all of this. The last release that Archibus have done, 25.2, have several screens or views that really consolidate a lot of metric. We call it dynamic workplace, that brings in information from hoteling, information from reservation, information about capacity and occupancy, and a lot of information about workplace as well, and specifically corrective maintenance that has to do with how many people have reported incidents, how many people, how many rooms are in fact available before, after cleaning, how many are not, how many individuals are at every class and who they are, or every workplace and who they are, and on and on and on. So those views are available in the last Archibus release, and we're working in the next releases to enhance those as well, including calculations of capacity and whatnot. Now, it's important to mention, and just like Fred have done when he talked about the what's new in 25.2 in the previous webinar, is that a lot of those enhancements that we have put forth are not just there for COVID. They are just good things to have anyway. And so they will be available regardless, right? So the new normal will have those for you to take advantage of regardless. So employee student status, or where they are in general. And by that I'm saying, who do they belong to? Can they come in different shifts and whatnot? So the status can actually change. And so that is something that is going to probably, well, definitely going to be with us moving forward. Same thing with room status, which is an attribute that was there, but then brought to the forth to make sure that we can take advantage of it just as well. Vacancies by day, occupancy planning by phase, and of course enhancement to the hoteling applications are all going to be there moving forward as well. So let's talk a little bit about the first scenario. The first scenario, we're actually going to identify space. So how do we look at space creatively and make sure that we identify it and then designate it in the right way, or define it in the right way? So what I have here is a school, in this case, an elementary K-6 school that I'm going to filter down to in a second. That school has several spaces that are, designed specifically for it. And in this case, you can see that it has 477 individual students that are coming every day to school. One way of really understand the space a little better is to apply a room name, and we actually added the room name into one of the labels. And you can see here that the school itself is broken down to classrooms all the way from kindergarten to 6th grade. Now, I would just say that there is quite a lot of challenge here in terms of really breaking down the occupancy and the capacity of individual rooms, just because, and let me stop it right here, just because those individual classrooms, as you guys well know, require different social distancing guidelines. So clearly the room that is available or should be available to a kindergarten classroom is completely different than the space that is available for, let's say, 6th grade. And that's just because of the way that individual or students in this case interact with space, move in space, and require social distancing. And I will just say that the whole term social distancing is not a new term. we think that I mean, at least for me, as I was researching this whole thing, because back to school for me, 6 months ago, or back to school, back to work in general, was relatively new, because we have not dealt with pandemic in the same way that we are dealing with them right now. But in a way, social distancing for people that are in fact designing space was not something that is out of the ordinary, just because students require specific space in order to do work at in the best way. So of course, first today, before the whole idea of social distancing is taking completely different meaning, and what we're meaning is actually how to keep individuals safe. Before that, it was just how to keep individual learning, in their optimal condition. But regardless, in order to reduce capacity, we can actually look at the individual space. And Archibus allows us, and you can see it right here, to actually set a target for the whole floor and say, let's say for this specific floor, I'm going to reduce the occupancy target by a certain percentage. Or in this case, I'm going to drop it by 40%, just because the 113 over there is just the square area that is assigned for a safe 6-foot radius for individual person. So if I actually take the 477 individual capacity that I have in that individual building divided by 113, what I'll get is about 190 students, which is a huge reduction, in this case 40% reduction exactly, from what I had before. That also leaves me to about 260 students are completely in the air. So what Archibus will allow me to do here is to set that occupancy reduction by floor. And once I do that, I can see the exact number, right? So you can see that right now I have 191 students and still 286 students that needs to be accommodated somehow. Now, as that happens, I actually need to look at the individual space and think about that space in terms of how do I reduce capacity to those individual rooms? Because originally the individual classrooms were already designed for capacity of normal capacity. In this case, is about 25 students in individual room. But of course, those capacity is going to be reduced about 40%, or to an occupancy of 40%, reduction of 60, which is quite a bit. So you can see here that as I go to those individuals classrooms, I can actually, and I'll do it in a second, I can actually reassign capacity. I can do it in bulk, right? Like I'm going to do in a second, but I can also do it individually for every classroom. Now, what I'm showing right now is other areas and functionalities that we have in school that are not necessarily classrooms, but can be used, in case we need it as classroom as well. So we talked about it before, and we said we had about 280 something additional students that still need accommodation. And we have a lot of area in a classroom that can accommodate those. And so Archibus can actually look at all the additional space like cafeteria, gyms, resource labs, computer labs, speech labs, and other. In this case, about 13,500 square feet of additional space that can be then appropriated for learning. But even that will only bring us to about 310 students in classrooms, and still 167 short. So we still have to somehow create a hybrid program where a lot of students, in fact, are going to will learn from home regardless, just because of lack of space, no matter what. So how do I look at my individual space? And that's what we're going to do right now. So first of all, we're actually going to look at those individual classrooms that we always knew are good for, learning. And we're going to click on those individually and then change the capacity of those classrooms from what they used to be to, what we know now they're going to be. So basically 40% occupancy. So from 25, we can, with one click of a button, reduce them very quickly to 40% reduction, which is about 10. Right, and save that and make sure. Now, what we do know right now that if we allocate individuals, the system will tell us it's overcapacity after we'll reach to 10 students in those individual classrooms. Now, in the same way, we could actually take the other spaces and now give them capacity, because right now the capacity of those spaces is 0, right? Because they are not designed as individual classrooms. And so we can, in the same way, just go to those individual spaces and assign them capacity. Now notice that in this case, the square footage of those classrooms is about 1,000 square feet, so the capacity will be about 12. So now it is a process that takes some time. So we have to go through all the rooms and make sure. But in the end, what you're going to have is a classroom in this case that is available for us to occupancy with the new capacity, and that is ready for us to actually place individuals right there. Now, what we need to think about right now, and this is the next sequence, is how do we are in fact taking the cohorts that I have, in this case students and staff, and categorize them correctly so I can then place them in those classrooms that are not now ready for occupancy. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at my employee standards and think about it creatively and say, can I in fact give individual students standards? So what we have done here is we actually created a bunch of standards by individual grade, and then assigned those standards to individuals. So we actually appropriated already attributes that Archibus provide out of the box, and then assign them in a way that will help us later on assign those individuals into classroom and really understand the cohorts in a much more robust way. So once we have done that, we move to this new view that we have, which is called Mark Employees for Return to Work. And now we have several more attributes per employee or per student that we can in fact work with. So first I'm going to look at that individual school. And notice that because I gave those employee standards, what I now have is a list of all those individual employees that are available for me standard by the correct standard. So now I'm looking at all the employees of the first grade, or in this case, all the students that belong to the first grade. Now, what Archibus also allows me to do is to add additional attributes. For instance, attribute that is called return to work information. Now, what I have done specifically here is thought about this creatively and say, I can actually take that individual, free-form attribute and just type a name of a teacher. So in this case, you can see on this specific column that this first grade actually have several teachers that teach it, and every set of students belong to that individual teacher. Now, beyond that, we also looked at, and I'm going to actually filter by an individual teacher, in this case, Mr. Jordan, and then break his cohort into additional, subsections, in this case, section 1 and section 2, right? Or phase 1 or phase 2, or shift, whatever you want to call it. And so in shift 1, the individual students are going to come to class on Monday and Tuesday. And so what I've done is I actually took all those individual students, gave them a teacher by return to work information, and gave them a day in the office, or in this case, day in school, by Monday and Tuesday. And these guys, they are not always remote, they're actually at school. So they always remote will actually going to stay now. So we can actually see quite a lot of information that I can apply in order to categorize my my students in this case in a much more robust way, right? And of course, save that. In the same way, I'm going to go to, in this case, shift 2 or section 2 or whatever, subsection 2, however you want to call it. Select them all and give them the attributes of coming into school on Wednesday and Thursday. right? Now, beyond that, I can also look at the full cohorts of Mr. Jordan, and I can see that there's also quite a lot of students here that are actually going to be always remote. And the reason for it could be varied. Like the most obvious reason is that there's just not enough room in the classroom to have everybody there at once. So that is clear. But beyond that, there's also a lot of students that won't be able to join normal activities and go back to school, even if they wanted to, because of pre-existing conditions and whatnot, and because they are a higher factor of risk. And so they will stay home. And we do want to accommodate, of course, them as well. And so understanding who is in and who is not in the classroom on those times and who is still around but working from home, or in this case, learning from home, is extremely important. Now, once I have this, the next phase is relatively simple, and that kind of follows Archibus's tradition, and that assigning those individuals to space. So I'm going to go back to the Space Council. I'm going to find that John Lewis Elementary School that we have here, find that specific floor plan, and filter it in the right ways that will allow us or help us assigning those individuals into space. So you can see occupancy here. Several classrooms were already occupied. I'm just going to place the name label so I can understand a little bit better of where I'm in fact placing those individuals. So as I zoom in, you can see that classroom 303 here is available and belongs to Mr. Jordan as well by label, right? And it's vacant at this point. I'm going to click on the occupancy tab just to see the full list of all the individual students on the left-hand side, and then filter it accordingly. So we actually added quite a lot of attributes to that individual grid. You can find it under the additional field little gear icon that you have there. And you can see here those. So what I'm going to do is, of course, I'm going to filter by the standard, which is going to be first grade. And I'm going to filter by return to work, which is going to be Mr. Jordan, like we've done before. In this case, shift 1. Right, so everything that I did in the mark to work view just a few seconds ago, I'm actually applying to the Space Council right here. So I'm going to select them all at once, right? You can see they are slated to actually come to 2 schools. Select them all at once and just click on the classroom and apply commit to make sure that these individuals will be recorded to be in that specific room. Now, in the same way, after it's recorded, now notice that right now the room turned to blue, which is still available because that individual room actually have a capacity of 10, and I just put 8 individuals in it. So it tells me at this point that they're still available. But as soon as I'm going to put in the shift 2 students, right, which I'm going to do right now, the room is automatically going to be over capacity. And that's because Archibus is looking at how many individuals are in that room, regardless of the day, which is something that we're working on actively, just to make sure that we break it down by day as well. But in this case, we're not there just yet. Even though it shows exceed capacity, in reality, those individuals are not going to be there at the same day, so to speak. So the reports that you can get out of it are quite robust, right? First of all, you can actually look at who's coming in on Monday and Tuesday. Just with one click of a button, the grid has been filtered for you to tells you exactly who's going to be at school on Monday and Tuesday by that individual teacher, right? Just like we've done a second ago. And in the same way, and it shows you also what classroom they're going to be in. In the same way, you can actually change the return to work information to the second shift, even without the actual days in the office, because the second shift is already billed as those days built in. So you can see those individuals that are coming into this classroom. And of course, if you take that completely out and just tells me who's going to be in the classroom in general on Monday and Tuesday, it's going to show you all the individual students by all teachers and all the rooms that are going to be available. And so you understand right now that I have 46 students in those 5 classrooms that I occupied, but of course way more if I occupy the whole school. So I hope that was clear. So what we have done before I move on is looked at the school creatively, understand the actual capacity after social distance guidelines for every individual space, spaces that are already available for learning, but also other spaces that I identify as conducive to learning, even though they were not designed for full-time learning. And then apply those individual categories to those students, and of course assign them all. And see all the reports of who's at school, who's working or learning from home at any given time. Now, in the same way, we can actually look at university students just as well. And the scenario that we concentrated on specifically is how to really apply this hoteling concept that we had to individual students that are coming to university. Where they can actually, from home, look at availability in the classroom, and then come in if there is room, or stay home and learn remotely if there isn't. Now, so very similarly to what we have done right now with the elementary school, the students of FMU here are actually going to look at those individual rooms that are in fact available. So you can see a whole set of individual lecture rooms. And now there are several ways of looking at the way that we design social distancing by guidelines, right? The first way that we looked at is looking at the actual total square footage of a space and then reducing it. In this case, I'm reducing the space by 50%. But another way of doing that is actually creating a condition, in this case, by going to AutoCAD and actually polylining every individual seat, and then applying the social distancing by geometry or individual circles around the seat. So what you see here is, in fact, two conditions side by side. The brown ones are permanent classrooms, right? So those are individual classrooms that we are going to just calculate by square footage and basically say, if the guidelines are 6 foot area, which in this case is about 113 square feet, I can actually take this entire square foot divided by that, which brings me a percentage. I can reduce the percentage altogether and see how many students I can fit. And that's going to be my capacity for this classroom. The other way of doing that is like you see here in the desk situation, where I'm actually outlining every individual seat. And then I'm checking whether if those seats are in fact comply with the social distancing guideline later on. So the first thing we're going to do, right, just like we have done before, is click on every individual classroom in this place and just see the capacity. You just run it and see the capacity behind the scenes. Right, so as I click on those individual classrooms and then go to view or edit selected rooms, it will allow me to, just like I've done before, do several things. In this case, the employee capacity varied, but more importantly for my purposes is notice that there is hotelable tab. I actually signed up as yes, because later on I want to apply the hoteling strategy to that individual school. Right, so that's important for me just to mention right here as we're doing that. Now, notice that different rooms actually have different capacities because different rooms have different areas. So that is the strategy that we're employing here, right? Not all of them are in fact have the same capacity just because some of them are in fact bigger. Now, in the other scenario, we said we actually went and outlined every individual rooms, and the capacity of every one of them is 1. So what we want to look at now, they're all hotelable and will be hotelable, but we actually want to go to every one of them and understand whether they are in fact available by those social distancing guidelines. So we're going to click on the social distancing tab that we developed in this Space Console version, and you can see that the 4-foot radius, which is a little bit more than 6, of course, 6 foot social distancing just in general, just to prove the point. You can see that all of them are in fact red because those individual circles are intersecting. So what we have done is we clicked on every individual space that we want to now designate as unavailable, because we want to actually create a floor plan, or in this case a classroom, that will give us an occupancy that complies with those guidelines and goes to the selected rooms or view room tab, see all of those individuals, and click on the one that we selected as do not use. So I actually gave them a new status. Now, when I go back to the view, notice that everything, well, first of all, notice that the social circle have completely changed, and now they're all green because the status, and now I'm going to highlight them by status, actually changed, right? So all those brownish color is now designated as do not use versus the green that is still designated as available. So this is something that we have done in the past, but now we're actually applying it to a classroom setting and say we can actually do that as well in the classroom. Of course, the problem with this, especially in elementary school, is how do you make sure that those individual seats remain where they are and will not move during cleaning or during kids that are rearranging and whatnot. You can put tapes on the ground, you can just bolt them to the floor. So there are different ways to in fact do that, but you need to take into account the feasibility of what you're in fact trying to do as well. Now from there we can actually go and apply our hoteling application. So in this case I'm going directly on my phone, finding that building, and then looking anywhere for the classroom that I in fact need to attend. In this case it's classroom 3, full day on the 18th, a few days ago. So I'm actually booking something that already passed, but that's okay, it's for the demonstration. And so as I do that, it tells me in this case that there is available space. So now I'm actually booked myself for classroom, which is great. Now, other students are going to come in and do the same thing again, right? The capacity of their room is set to 12. And so as individual students are in fact booking themselves to the classroom, the capacity eventually going to be met. And what you're going to see here is the room completely turned unavailable for them for that individual time, for that individual day. So the next day, if there's a classroom there as well, the room is available again, of course. Now remember, we actually applied also services connected to hoteling. So once that individual room is going to be booked, it will automatically turn as unavailable until services, in this case cleaning services, will actually be performed on it. And once the cleaning services have been completed, then the room will turn available again. So those were connected much more robustly in the last Archibus release and to take advantage of. So whether you're booking a desk, or in this case, whether you're booking an actual classroom, the services and the restriction on availability still applies. Now, another way of doing that is just defining a specific QR code and then just pasting it or taping it outside of the door of the classroom. So in this case, in the defined location under the defined rooms views, you actually go find that individual location or the individual room. You can apply a label if you want to. In this case, make sure you click on the QR for occupancy purposes. Click on that individual room and create a QR code from it. And that QR code, as you can see here, can then be taped or at the door of that individual classroom if needed. Now the process is quite simple. An individual can come with their phone with a QR reader, as I'm doing here, find that individual classroom, and then go directly to the workplace. All the information about the classroom will automatically be presented to them, and they can book it immediately from their phone as they move forward. So what we've seen here in this sequence is trying to actually take the space that you have, in this case, in a university environment, and break it down in different strategies, in this case, hoteling strategies, and allowing individuals to actually book their own classroom, knowing that the space that is available to them is limited. Now, what it will allow administrators to do, of course, and you can see it right now, is to look at who is coming and who is going to be in the classroom, because I understand exactly who booked ahead of time. And in this case, controlling in a better way the cohorts and creating plans and utilization for the future to really understand, or plan for the future, I should say, to really understand the way how I adjust my strategies for it to be as safe as possible for my students and my individual teachers or staff or whatnot. So that's what we have right here. So if I'll just sum up before we go to the questions, what we have done is looked at two scenarios. One, K-6 school, where we looked at the available space creatively. We found space that is available beyond just the classroom, and we adjust capacity. Then we looked at individuals, in this case students. We adjust their attributes to make sure that we can now assign them to space safely. And of course, understand who is at the classroom, who is learning from home, who is coming at different shifts and whatnot. And then bring the back or return to school in those schools to a situation to be as safe as possible. In the same way, we looked at maybe a higher ed scenario where we have individual classrooms that we can look at that space of those classrooms creatively and say some of it will be reduced by square footage, maybe others will be reduced by social distancing circles. Both of them will eventually inform capacity. And then we can then tie everything to hoteling strategies and allow students to, in fact, just like workers, in fact, book their class and then be present or actually take the class remotely. That will conclude our demo for today. I will just open it for questions. Danielle?
Great, thank you, Bar. That was a great overview and some very creative solutions. So we have one question so far. If you have any questions, just a reminder, you can type them in the question or chat sections. You can also raise your hand. There's a little hand raise icon, and we can open the microphone up for you to ask your question if you would prefer that. So the question that we have right now, Bar, is you mentioned scheduling the cleaning of rooms. How would you automate that between the bookings?
One of the parameters that the hotel application have is the time when that individual hoteling ends. What we have done is we actually said that if that individual room is booked that day, there's a service request that in fact going out at the end day of that is actually designated for that hotel room. And then if that individual service is not fulfilled, that means not done, that room is changed status to unavailable until that service request is completed. That is already part of the hoteling application as it is right now.
Great, thank you. Maybe while we're waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, we can go to just a quick couple of reminders that we have. Yeah. So Bar, if you don't mind.
No.
Perfect. So one of the applications that Bar mentioned, the health and safety offer, we're actually giving away free new licenses until the end of September of next year. So if you want some more information on that, you can go to info.archibus.com/EHS-offer. And all of this information will be included in the email that we send out with the recording. So don't feel like you have to remember that URL. And then on the next slide, we have just a reminder of our Back to Work Resource Center. So this is where we are posting all of our webinar recordings, all of our guides, any interviews that we've been doing on back to work and back to school. That's all here in this one spot for you, and that is info.archibus.com/back-to-work. And again, this will be included in the email with the recording. All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. If you think of something, please feel free to reach out to us. And again, Michael and Bar, thank you so much for presenting today, and we thank you all for joining us. Have a good one and stay safe.
Take care, guys.